My name is Eleanor Wade, and I'm 71 years old. I've been a widow for almost 2 years, long enough to learn that people treat you differently when they think you have nothing left to offer. They see gray hair and assume you're a faded photograph, quiet, harmless, and easy to push aside. But that evening, in the glittering reception hall of my daughter's wedding, I sat behind a tower of lilies and roses big enough to hide a gravestone, and I felt anything but harmless. From my seat in the shadows, I could just see Lauren, my only child, float across the dance floor in white satin. Her new husband, Ethan Crowell, beamed like a man who'd just won more than a bride. Across the room, his parents mingled like local royalty, shaking hands, sharing air kisses, all without glancing my way. I'd been told table assignments were a little tight, but this felt deliberate and exiled to the floral wilderness. When Ethan finally made his way toward me, his smile had the kind of polish you don't learn from kindness. He leaned down his cufflinks, catching the light. "Mrs. Wade," he said warmly, "I'd love to take you to dinner sometime this week. Just the two of us. Talk about family matters." I sipped my water, letting the coolness settle on my tongue. "Family matters," I echoed, keeping my voice light. That sounds intriguing. If Ethan noticed the edge beneath my words, he didn't show it. He straightened his tie, confident as a man who believes the game is already his. "You'll enjoy it. I have ideas that could make all our lives easier." In my lap, my hands stayed still, but my mind was already moving. For 2 years, I'd kept a secret my late husband entrusted only to me, a fortune of over $30 million hidden behind layers of protection. I'd worn modest clothes, driven an aging sedan, let the world believe I was living on a widow's pension. Now here was Ethan inviting me to dinner with that gleam in his eye. And as I watched him walk away, weaving between guests like a man scanning for opportunities, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever game he was about to start, I was going to finish. Ethan didn't waste time. 3 days after the wedding, my phone rang just before lunch. I was in the kitchen halfway through slicing a pear when his voice poured through the line like warm syrup. "Mrs. Wade, I was thinking we could do that dinner tomorrow night. I know a place you'll love, quiet, discreet." I set the knife down and glanced at the calendar pinned to the fridge. The space was empty, except for the note I'd written in my own hand, "Stay invisible." My husband Paul had once told me that in chess, the most dangerous pieces are the ones your opponent forgets to watch. "Tomorrow works," I said, keeping my tone almost apologetic, like I was grateful for the attention. "But you'll have to forgive me, Ethan. I'm not much for fine dining." "That's the beauty of this place," he said smoothly. "They'll make you feel at home." I could almost hear him smiling. After we hung up, I stood by the sink, letting the quiet stretch around me. My house, an old shingle-style place on the bluff, was filled with reminders of Paul, his fishing rods in the mudroom, his leather armchair facing the bay. Somewhere behind a locked door in the basement was the life he'd built for us, and the reason I'd learned to play the part of a modest widow so convincingly. But Ethan's eagerness told me something he was in a hurry. Men like him didn't invite themselves into the lives of women like me without a reason, and reasons that urgent usually came down to one thing: money. I picked up the pear again, finished slicing it, and ate each piece slowly, the juice sweet and deliberate on my tongue. If Ethan thought I'd be an easy mark, he was about to find out I'd been sharpening my knives for years. The next evening, I drove into Portland just as the winter light began to fade, the sky bruised with lavender and gray. Ethan had chosen a restaurant that sat on the waterfront, all glass walls and white tablecloths, the kind of place where the waiters move like stagehands in a silent play. He was already there, waving me over with a practiced warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "Eleanor," he said, standing just long enough to brush a kiss against my cheek, "you look wonderful." I smiled faintly. "You have a talent for flattery." Once the menus were taken away and the wine was poured something French with a name I didn't bother to remember, Ethan leaned forward, elbows just shy of the linen. "I've been thinking about your situation." He began, his voice soft enough that it forced me to lean in. "My situation?" I asked, letting the question hang. "You're alone now," he said, tilting his head in that way people do when they're pretending to be concerned. "Big house, all those decisions. It can get overwhelming. And there are people out there who'd take advantage of someone with your trusting nature." I stirred the ice in my water, keeping my gaze steady. "How thoughtful of you to worry." "I just want you protected," he said, sliding a manila folder across the table. Inside were legal documents, power of attorney control over financial accounts, authority over medical decisions. With me and Lauren managing things, you wouldn't have to lift a finger. It was almost elegant the way he dressed his trap in silk and good intentions. I closed the folder, resting my hands on top of it. This is quite a lot to take in. Of course. "Take your time," he said, though the faint flicker in his smile told me patience wasn't his strong suit. Neither was mine. But for now, I needed him to believe otherwise. That night, long after I'd driven home and the wind off the bay had started rattling the shutters, I went down to the basement. The concrete steps were cold under my feet, each one carrying me deeper into the life Paul had kept carefully tucked away. The storage room smelled of cedar and salt. Against the far wall stood a bookcase loaded with nautical charts and old tackle boxes. I pressed my hand against the panel behind it, feeling for the faint ridge I'd found once by accident. The latch clicked, and the panel swung inward to reveal the steel face of a safe. For 2 years, I'd avoided it, not because I didn't know what was inside, but because opening it would mean facing everything Paul had hidden from the world and from our own daughter. Tonight, I didn't hesitate. The combination turned easily under my fingers. Inside were neat stacks of file folders, bound ledgers, and a thick envelope with my name written in Paul's handwriting. My hands trembled as I slid the letter free. "If you're reading this, Ellie, it means someone is trying to take from you what I spent my life building. You have more than $30 million in assets, all protected in a trust Clara Benson helped me establish. Trust her. Trust yourself. And don't let anyone near it without a fight." I sat on the old stool by his workbench, reading those lines again and again until the cold settled into my bones. Paul had known. Not about Ethan specifically, but about the kind of predator he would become. By the time I climbed back upstairs, I knew my next move. Tomorrow I'd be on the first train to Boston to meet Clara Benson. Ethan thought he was playing chess. He didn't know I had a queen still on the board. The morning train to Boston rattled through snow-dusted pines, its windows fogging with each exhale from the passengers. I held Paul's letter in my lap, my thumb resting over his signature as if I could still feel the pressure of his pen. Clara Benson's office sat in a narrow brick building near the harbor. Inside, it smelled faintly of lemon polish and coffee. She was waiting for me in the doorway, a tall woman with sharp eyes and the kind of handshake that says she's closed deals people didn't think possible. "Paul told me you might come," she said, ushering me in. "I wish it were under better circumstances." I sank into a leather chair across from her desk. "He mentioned you in his letter. Said I could trust you." "You can," she replied without hesitation. "I drafted the trust he left for you. It's airtight, no one can touch the assets, not even if you sign away power of attorney. But if someone's trying, we can turn that to your advantage." I told her about Ethan, about the folder across the restaurant table, about his careful performance of concern. Clara listened without interrupting, jotting notes in a neat, slanted script. "He's moving fast," she said finally. "That tells me 2 things: he's in trouble, and he thinks you're an easy mark." I allowed myself a thin smile. Then maybe it's time we let him think that a little longer. Clara leaned back, studying me. "If you're willing, we can build a case. But it will mean playing along until he exposes himself completely." "I've been playing along for 2 years," I said. "I can manage a little longer." When I left her office, the harbor wind was sharp against my face. For the first time since Ethan's invitation, I felt steady. This wasn't just about protecting Paul's fortune anymore. It was about making sure Ethan never tried this with anyone else. 2 days later, I called Ethan from the sunroom, my voice wrapped in just enough warmth to sound convincingly open. I've been thinking about what you said I told him. Maybe you're right. Maybe I do need a little help with things." There was a pause, then the faint hum of satisfaction in his tone. "I'm glad you see it that way. Why don't I come by with the paperwork and we can go over it together?" "That would be fine," I said, as if I hadn't already agreed with Clara that this was exactly what we wanted. When he arrived the next afternoon, the air smelled of salt and thawing earth. He brought the same manila folder, his suit pressed to perfection, and a pen that gleamed like a trophy. "I thought we could just go through these line by line," he said, settling into the armchair across from me. I leaned forward, my reading glasses low on my nose, letting my eyes skim the dense paragraphs. "And once I sign these, what happens?" "Well," he began smoothly, "Lauren and I would have authority to handle your finances, approve medical care, even make housing arrangements. You'd be free of all the day-to-day burdens." I kept my expression neutral. "And if I change my mind," he chuckled low and dismissive. "These agreements are permanent, Eleanor. They're designed to protect you from impulsive decisions." That was the first crack, the slip of control behind the charm. Clara, listening through the small transmitter clipped under my sweater, would be noting every word. I closed the folder and handed it back. "It's a lot to think about. I'll need some time." "Of course," he said, though. The tension in his jaw betrayed him. When he left, the ocean breeze slid in through the open window. I breathed it in, thinking of how the tide works, slow, steady, relentless. Ethan was standing too close to the edge, and the water was coming in. The plan came together over coffee in Clara's office, the winter wind rattling against the old windows. We'd let Ethan believe I'd had a change of heart, that I was ready to sign everything over. The difference this time was that the living room of my old shingle house would be wired with more recording equipment than a police interview room. 2 days later, I called him. I made my voice sound tentative, almost embarrassed. "Ethan, I think you might have been right all along. I've been feeling vulnerable." There was a pause, then the quick inhale of a man smelling victory. "I can be there tomorrow. We'll make sure you're protected." Protected? The word tasted bitter, but I let it pass. 3 o'clock, perfect, he said. The next afternoon, a black sedan pulled up my drive. Ethan stepped out with a notary in tow, his briefcase swinging like it held the keys to my life. Inside, he spread the papers across my coffee table, each page perfectly aligned. "This will make things so much easier for you," he said, guiding my hand to the first signature line. I signed one page, then another, my pen strokes, slow, deliberate. "You know," I said lightly, "Paul might have had more tucked away than anyone realized. Old accounts, investments." His eyes flickered greed, flashing like a fish breaking water. "How much more enough to make this worth your while?" I said, setting down the pen before the final page. He leaned closer, hungry for details. And that's when Clara's signal came from the hallway. The notary's pen froze mid-air as 2 plainclothes officers stepped into the room. "Ethan Crowell," one announced, "you're under arrest for attempted exploitation of an elder." He looked at me, shock draining the color from his face. I only smiled. "Consider yourself protected." The arraignment was held in the small brick courthouse downtown, its wooden benches polished smooth by decades of bodies shifting under bad news. I sat in the second row behind the prosecution table, hands folded neatly in my lap, while Ethan was led in, wearing the same suit he'd worn to our first dinner, minus the confidence. He scanned the room, his gaze catching mine for the briefest second before flicking away. His lawyer, a young man with a too shiny tie, whispered urgently in his ear as the clerk read the charges: attempted financial exploitation, fraud, conspiracy. Each count landed like a hammer. When the prosecution played the recording from my living room, the air in the courtroom shifted. Ethan's voice filled the space, smooth, coaxing, dripping with the promise of safety if I'd just hand him the keys to my life. Then came his slip about making housing arrangements and his interest in hidden accounts. The judge's expression didn't change, but I noticed the tightening at the corners of her mouth. Afterward in the hallway, Clara joined me near the tall windows. "He's rattled," she said. "He thought you'd fold before it got this far." Then he underestimated me. I replied, watching Ethan's parents huddle with his lawyer across the hall. Bail was set high enough to sting, and though his family scraped it together, the message was clear. This wouldn't be a quick escape. The district attorney had already linked Ethan to at least 3 similar cases in neighboring counties. Driving home along the coast, I rolled down the window despite the cold. The sea air was sharp bracing like the clean break after something long overdue. Paul had left me the means to protect myself. But now I realized he'd also given me the means to protect others, and I intended to use every last dollar to make sure Ethan's kind never walked into another widow's home again. Winter along the Maine coast can make the days feel short and the nights endless, but that season passed in a blur of strategy meetings and legal paperwork. Clara and I sat at my kitchen table most afternoons, her laptop open, my coffee steaming between us as we pieced together the trail Ethan had left behind. It was longer than either of us had expected. There were bank transfers to shell companies, phony investment opportunities pitched to other widows, even a forged signature on a deed for a house that had been in one family for 70 years. The deeper we dug, the more names appeared, people whose lives had been hollowed out by the same charming smile Ethan had shown me at Lauren's wedding. "I can keep turning this over to law enforcement," Clara said one evening, "but with your resources, we could go bigger. Build something that doesn't just react, something that hunts these men before they strike." I thought of Paul's letter, the way his words had felt, both protective and like a challenge. What would it take? Funding, a structure, investigators willing to partner with us, the will to make enemies in all the right places. I nodded slowly. Enemies don't bother me. By spring, the Harbor Shield Foundation existed on paper and in purpose a nonprofit dedicated to protecting older adults from financial exploitation. We hired 2 retired detectives, a forensic accountant, and a woman named Maggie, whose specialty was unraveling digital scams. The first thank you letter arrived before we even held a public launch. A retired teacher in Vermont had gotten her deed back after a fraudulent sale was voided. She wrote in a careful hand, "I thought my life was over. Now I have a home again." I tucked the letter into Paul's old desk drawer. This was what his money was meant to do, and I was just getting started. Lauren showed up unannounced one Saturday morning, her SUV crunching over the gravel drive. She stood on my porch in a wool coat, hair pulled back, eyes darting between me and the road, as if she'd been debating turning around the whole way here. "I heard about Ethan," she began, her voice tight. I opened the door wider. "Come in, unless you'd rather the neighbors see you out here." Inside, she perched on the edge of the armchair, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched. "I didn't know what he was doing to you," she said quickly. "Not exactly. I knew he was persuasive, but I thought he just wanted to make sure you were safe." I studied her face. "You knew he was pressuring me to sign away control. You knew he'd done it before to other women." Her gaze dropped. "I didn't know about the others." "That's convenient," I said evenly. "And what about the way he kept me out of family decisions, the times you stood by while he spoke for you?" She flinched, but didn't argue. "You're my daughter-in-law." I continued, my voice low but steady. "Paul trusted you once. I did too. But trust isn't something you can borrow and never return." Tears pooled in her eyes, but I didn't soften. This wasn't about cruelty. It was about truth. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "If I'd known where it would lead, you knew enough to ask questions," I interrupted. "And you chose not to." She stood, smoothing her coat. "I don't expect you to forgive me." "Good," I said, walking her to the door, "because forgiveness is earned, not assumed." As she left, the wind carried the faint scent of the sea into the hallway. I closed the door and leaned against it, not relieved, not angry, just certain that some ties could only be mended from a distance. Summer returned to the coast with its long evenings and golden lights spilling across the harbor. By then, Ethan's trial had concluded guilty on all counts, his sentence long enough to keep him out of reach of anyone's inheritance for decades. His name had become a cautionary whisper in community centers and estate planning seminars. Harbor Shield had grown faster than I imagined. We were fielding calls from as far as Arizona, partnering with local police departments and hosting workshops where older adults learned how to spot the kinds of traps Ethan had set for me. Clara insisted I speak at the first one, though. Public speaking had never been my preference. Standing at the podium in the library's meeting hall, I looked out at the faces, some lined with age, others still in the middle years, but already caretakers for their parents. "I'm not here to tell you to be afraid," I began. "I'm here to tell you to be ready. People like Ethan don't come with warning labels. They come with smiles. And sometimes they come wearing a suit to your own family's wedding." There was a ripple of knowing laughter, the kind that comes when pain is shared, but no longer raw. Afterward, a woman about my age approached, her silver hair catching the light. "You turned what could have broken you into something that protects others," she said. "That's rare." I thought of Paul then, not just the wealth he'd left me, but the faith. "It's what he would have wanted," I replied. That evening, back at the house, I opened the windows to the sound of gulls and the slow hush of the tide. My life was quieter now, steadier, but not small. I had learned that age didn't have to mean retreat. It could mean strategy, precision, and the freedom to fight battles worth winning. And as the sun sank into the horizon, I knew this was only the beginning.